In 1931, a young German architect sat among a crowd, listening to a political speech that would quietly redirect the course of his life and, ultimately, the machinery of mass murder. Albert Speer did not arrive as a radical. He was not driven by street violence, racial obsession, or revolutionary fury. He came as a man searching for purpose, order, and belonging in a nation humiliated by defeat and economic collapse. What he encountered that evening was Adolf Hitler. Hitler spoke not only of enemies and betrayal, but of destiny. He spoke of rebuilding Germany physically, symbolically, eternally. For Speer, architecture was not merely a profession, it was a language of permanence. And Hitler, a failed artist with grandiose visions, spoke it fluently. Speer joined the Nazi Party soon afterward. At first, his role was minor. He designed modest renovations, assisted senior architects, and waited. He learned quickly that proximity to Hitler was everything. Speer watched how others spoke too loudly, how they tried to impress. He did the opposite. He listened. He waited. He let Hitler talk. It worked. By the mid-1930s, Speer was no longer just another architect. He had become Hitler's architect, the man entrusted with translating ideology into stone, steel, and spectacle. When Paul Trost, Hitler's favored architect, died in 1934, Speer stepped into the void. Suddenly, he was responsible for some of the regime's most ambitious projects. He redesigned Berlin into Germania, a planned imperial capital meant to dwarf Paris and Rome. He built colossal rally grounds at Nuremberg, where architecture and mass psychology fused into ritual. These structures were not neutral, they were instruments of power. The towering columns, endless avenues, and overwhelming scale were designed to reduce the individual to insignificance and elevate the state to myth. Speer understood this instinctively. His buildings did not just house events, they produced emotion, awe, submission, destiny. Hitler adored him. Speer became a constant presence at meals, on train rides, at building sites. He learned when to speak and when to remain silent. Unlike other Nazi elites, he avoided ideological grandstanding. He presented himself as efficient, apolitical, indispensable. By the late 1930s, Albert Speer was inside the Führer's inner circle. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, plunging Europe into war, Speer did not hesitate or object. He stood with Hitler. He accepted the war as inevitable, necessary, even creative. Destruction, after all, required rebuilding. In 1940, after France fell, Speer traveled with Hitler to Paris. The two men walked through the conquered city together, visiting architectural landmarks. Hitler dreamed aloud of what Berlin would become once Europe was subdued. Speer listened, absorbed, and planned. This was not the behavior of a passive technocrat. It was the behavior of a man who understood exactly where power resided and chose to stand beside it. As war intensified, architecture alone was no longer enough. Germany needed more than monuments. It needed total mobilization. Fate intervened in 1940 when Fritz Todt, Minister of Armaments, died suddenly in a plane crash. Hitler made a swift decision. He appointed Albert Speer as Todt's successor. The architect became the engineer of war. Speer now controlled Germany's industrial output, its weapons, factories, and production systems. He reorganized industry, centralized authority, and increased efficiency. Against all expectations, German arms production rose even as Allied bombs devastated cities. Too many contemporaries, Speer appeared brilliant. To history, this was the moment he crossed the line from symbolic enabler to operational criminal, because production demanded labor. And labor was running out. Speer did not protest. He did not resign. He solved the problem. Millions of men and women were enslaved, foreign civilians, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates. They were transported into factories, mines, and workshops. They were fed barely enough to survive. They worked until their bodies failed. This was not chaos, it was policy. Speer's system functioned because suffering was built into it. Every increased output figure was balanced against human exhaustion and death. The factories ran longer, the bodies collapsed faster. And throughout it all, Speer remained close to Hitler, calm, capable, efficient. He would later claim ignorance. He would claim distance. He would claim regret. But in these years, Albert Speer was not a bystander. He was indispensable. If this documentary analysis is helping you see World War II from a deeper, more revealing perspective, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It directly helps this work reach more people and supports the creation of serious, research-driven history like this. By the early 1940s, Speer was no longer merely designing the Reich, he was sustaining it. And as Germany marched toward catastrophe, the architect of power would soon be forced to confront the consequences of his efficiency. Albert Speer assumed control of Germany's armaments at a moment when the war was already turning against the Reich. The lightning victories of 1939 and 1940 had given way to grinding attrition. On the Eastern Front, German armies were bleeding men and machines at a catastrophic rate. In the air, Allied bombers were beginning to reduce German cities to rubble. By any rational measure, the war should have begun winding down. Instead, it intensified. Speer's appointment in 1940 marked a decisive shift. He centralized authority that had previously been fragmented among competing Nazi agencies. He cut through bureaucratic infighting, standardized production models, and rationalized supply chains. Where chaos had reigned, Speer imposed order. Where inefficiency had slowed output, he demanded results. The numbers spoke for themselves. Tank production rose, aircraft output increased. Ammunition supplies stabilized. Even as factories were bombed and transport lines shattered, Germany somehow produced more weapons than before. To Hitler, this confirmed Speer's genius. But the miracle had a cost, and that cost was human life. Germany did not have enough workers to sustain this industrial surge. Millions of German men were at the front, dead, wounded, or trapped in endless combat. Women were already working to capacity. The solution Speer embraced was not innovation, it was exploitation. Foreign laborers were seized from occupied territories. Prisoners of war were reclassified as industrial manpower. Concentration camp inmates were transferred directly into armaments production. Entire factories were built adjacent to camps to minimize transport time and maximize output. This was not improvisation, it was design. Speer's ministry coordinated closely with the SS, whose camps supplied a steady stream of disposable labor. Men and women arrived malnourished, terrified, and exhausted. They worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. They slept in barracks that bred disease. Punishment was constant, death was expected. Speer later claimed he had no direct authority over the camps. This was technically true and morally meaningless. His ministry requested labor quotas. The SS delivered them. If workers died, replacements arrived, production figures rose, bodies vanished. By 1943, Allied bombing campaigns intensified. Cities like Hamburg, Essen, and Berlin burned. Entire neighborhoods were erased, yet Speer adapted. He dispersed factories underground. He relocated production into tunnels, mines, and forests. The Reich, bleeding from every side, became a subterranean war economy fueled by coerced labor and fear. Even Hitler's increasingly irrational orders did not break Speer's effectiveness. When Hitler demanded impossible output increases, Speer promised compliance. When generals warned of collapse, Speer produced charts showing growth. He became the regime's last illusion of control, and Hitler listened. Speer was granted extraordinary autonomy. He could bypass party officials, overrule regional leaders, and command resources at will. While other Nazis jockeyed for favor, Speer delivered results. He was not a loud ideologue. He was something more dangerous, competent. As Germany's military position worsened, Speer faced a choice. He could have slowed production. He could have allowed the war economy to fail naturally. He could have refused further exploitation. He did none of these things. Instead, he intensified the system. In late 1944, with Allied forces advancing from both west and east, Hitler ordered a scorched earth policy, destroy infrastructure, factories, and transport networks so nothing would fall into enemy hands. Speer quietly sabotaged aspects of this order, preserving industrial assets he believed would be necessary after the war. This act would later be cited as evidence of his humanity. It was also evidence of his foresight. Speer was already thinking beyond defeat. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins, refugees clogged roads. The Eastern Front disintegrated under Soviet pressure. Yet weapons still rolled off assembly lines, and munition still flowed to the front. The war continued not because it could be won, but because it had not yet been allowed to die. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin. The Third Reich effectively ended that day, though fighting would continue briefly. The man who had elevated Speer was gone, and with him vanished protection. Suddenly, the qualities that had made Speer invaluable became liabilities. He had been everywhere. He had overseen everything. He had left a paper trail of efficiency reports and production schedules tied directly to forced labor. The Nazi leadership fractured. Some fled, some hid, some attempted to negotiate. Loyalty dissolved into survival instinct. Speer understood the danger immediately. He knew the Allies would not judge him by intentions, but by outcomes. He knew that the camps once denied, hidden, or euphemized were now exposed. And he knew that his signature lay beneath policies that had worked human beings to death. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, Albert Speer did not resist arrest. He did not attempt suicide. He prepared a different strategy, one that would redefine his legacy. But before that strategy could be tested, the world itself had to confront what had been built, operated, and sustained in the shadows of Speer's factories. The camps were opening, the dead were being counted. And justice, however imperfect, was on its way. With Adolf Hitler dead and Berlin in ruins, the Third Reich disintegrated with astonishing speed. The ideological certainty that had bound the Nazi leadership together evaporated overnight. What remained was fear of capture, fear of exposure, fear of judgment. For Albert Speer, the collapse was both expected and terrifying. Unlike fanatics who clung to fantasies of last-minute victory, Speer had long understood that Germany was finished. He had seen the production figures, the destroyed cities, the endless demands for labor that could no longer be met. He knew that the war he had kept alive was now unsalvageable. And he knew something else. When the reckoning came, his name would be everywhere. In the final weeks of the war, as Nazi officials scattered in every direction, Speer moved north toward Flensburg, near the Danish border. There, a short-lived successor government under Admiral Karl Dönitz attempted to preserve a veneer of authority while negotiating surrender with the Allies. It was a farce, but a dangerous one. Speer did not attempt to hide his identity. Instead, he positioned himself carefully. He attended meetings. He spoke rationally. He presented himself as a stabilizing presence amid the chaos. Where others ranted or schemed, Speer appeared cooperative, controlled, almost relieved that the nightmare was over. But even as he maneuvered, the hunters were already closing in. As Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, they uncovered what had long been dismissed as propaganda. British and American soldiers entered concentration camps Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, found evidence of industrialized death that defied comprehension. They saw crematoria, they saw emaciated survivors. They saw piles of bodies. The world learned the truth not through documents, but through sight and smell. Investigators followed the advancing troops. Intelligence officers gathered records, interrogated survivors, and reconstructed chains of command. Names emerged again and again, men who had not personally killed, but who had made killing possible. Albert Speer was one of them. By this stage, the Allies had already made a critical decision. In 1943, long before victory was assured, they had agreed that the Nazi leadership would not simply be executed or imprisoned quietly. Instead, they would be placed on trial before the world. This was unprecedented. Never before had defeated leaders been subjected to a formal international tribunal. The purpose was not revenge, it was legitimacy. The Allies wanted to establish a historical record to demonstrate that these crimes were not accidents of war, but deliberate policies carried out by identifiable individuals. The Nuremberg Trials were taking shape. Speer was arrested in May 1945 and placed in Allied custody. Unlike some of his peers, he did not deny the crimes outright. He did not insist on total ignorance. Instead, he began refining a narrative, one that acknowledged guilt in the abstract while distancing himself from the concrete horrors. It was a subtle strategy, and it was deliberate. While other Nazi leaders raged, deflected blame, or proclaimed loyalty to Hitler until the end, Speer did something radical. He admitted moral responsibility. He claimed he had been blind. He claimed he had been deceived. He claimed he had been focused on technical tasks, not human consequences. Most importantly, he positioned himself as different. As investigators prepared indictments, Speer cooperated. He answered questions calmly. He did not challenge the legitimacy of the tribunal. He expressed regret, carefully worded, non-specific, but emotionally effective. Behind the scenes, this behavior mattered. The Allies were not unified in their approach to justice. The war had ended, but another conflict was already forming. Relations between the Western powers and the Soviet Union were deteriorating. The Cold War loomed. Knowledge became a currency. Speer possessed it in abundance. He understood German industry, logistics, and war production at a level few others did. He knew how the Reich had sustained itself under bombardment. He knew how economies could be mobilized under total war conditions. To some Allied planners, this made him dangerous. To others, it made him valuable. As the Nuremberg indictments were finalized, Speer was charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Documents showed his ministry's involvement in forced labor. Testimony linked his production increases directly to the expansion of camp labor. Execution was a real possibility. Yet something about Speer unsettled expectations. He did not behave like a man facing death. He behaved like a man making a case not for innocence, but for survival. When the trial began in November 1945, Speer stood among the most notorious figures of the Nazi regime: Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and others. Some mocked the court, some denied everything. Some showed open contempt. Speer did not. He spoke softly. He accepted collective blame. He avoided confrontation. And in doing so, he separated himself. The judges were not immune to this contrast, nor were the observers. In a courtroom filled with defiance and arrogance, Speer appeared almost reasonable, but reasonableness does not erase responsibility. Behind Speer's calm demeanor lay a system that had consumed millions of lives. The factories he managed were filled with people who had no names, no rights, and no future. His efficiency had prolonged a war that killed countless civilians and soldiers alike. The question before the tribunal was not whether Albert Speer had committed crimes. It was how the world would choose to punish a man whose guilt was managerial, bureaucratic, and devastatingly effective. If this investigation into power, guilt, and survival is deepening your understanding of World War II, please click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps this work reach a wider audience and supports the creation of serious, uncompromising historical documentaries like this. As the trial moved toward its verdict, one truth became unavoidable: justice, like war, is shaped by circumstance. And Albert Speer was about to discover just how much circumstance could matter. When the verdicts were read at Nuremberg, the courtroom fell silent in anticipation. For months, the world had watched the Nazi leadership placed on trial not in secrecy, but before history itself. This was meant to be justice rendered without passion, without vengeance, and without compromise. But justice, even at Nuremberg, was not immune to calculation. Albert Speer stood as the sentences were announced. Around him, men who had shared Hitler's table signed death warrants, and commanded armies received their fate. Some were sentenced to death by hanging, others to life imprisonment. When Speer's sentence was read 20 years in prison, it stunned many observers. He had escaped the gallows. The decision was framed as measured and principled. Speer had admitted responsibility. He had expressed remorse. He had, unlike the others, acknowledged the moral dimension of his crimes. In the eyes of the tribunal, this mattered, but it was not the whole story. Behind the scenes, Speer's survival had been quietly negotiated by forces that rarely appear in official transcripts. Western Allied planners were already shifting their focus. Germany was defeated, but the Soviet Union was emerging as a rival. Knowledge of German industry, logistics, and wartime production suddenly carried new significance. Speer possessed that knowledge. A group of American officials and advisors, including figures connected to post-war economic planning, argued that executing Speer would destroy a valuable source of insight. They wanted him alive. They wanted him studied. They wanted him useful, so Speer lived. He was sent to Spandau prison in Berlin, where he would serve his 20-year sentence alongside other convicted Nazi leaders. The prison was cold, regimented, and relentlessly monotonous. Speer gardened, read, and wrote. He reflected or at least appeared to. During those years, Speer refined his final transformation. He became a penitent. He wrote memoirs that portrayed himself as a man seduced by power, blinded by proximity to Hitler, and unaware of the full scale of the crimes committed under his authority. He emphasized moments of doubt. He highlighted his quiet resistance to Hitler's scorched earth orders. He framed himself as a tragic figure, a technician who lost his moral compass in the machinery of dictatorship. When Speer was released in 1966, he stepped into a world eager to listen. His books sold millions of copies. He gave interviews. He became a respected voice on the inner workings of the Nazi regime. Journalists called him the good Nazi. Historians debated his sincerity. The public consumed his story. But beneath the carefully constructed image lay omissions that could not be ignored. Speer claimed ignorance of the extermination camps, yet documents and testimony showed repeated contact with SS leadership and direct involvement in labor allocations from concentration camps. He claimed moral blindness, yet his own reports detailed death rates, exhaustion, and replacement needs. He had not merely known, he had calculated. Speer's greatest success was not industrial, it was narrative. He understood that post-war societies needed explanations that preserved faith in expertise and modernity. By presenting himself as a cautionary tale rather than a villain, he offered something comforting, the idea that evil could be unintentional. That idea was false. Albert Speer did not design gas chambers. He did not command execution squads. He did something more enduring. He made mass death efficient. The system he managed converted human suffering into output metrics. It reduced people to labor units and replaced them when they failed. His decisions extended the war, increased casualties, and bound industrial progress to moral collapse. And yet, he died a free man in 1981, wealthy, published, and widely known. This is the unresolved tension at the heart of Speer's story. Was justice served, or was it compromised by convenience? The Nuremberg Trials established a precedent for international law. They named crimes against humanity and placed individuals on trial for state-sponsored murder. They mattered. But Speer's case exposed the limits of that justice. In the aftermath of catastrophe, the world did not only punish guilt, it preserved usefulness. Albert Speer's legacy forces an uncomfortable reckoning that evil does not always announce itself with rage or cruelty. Sometimes it arrives with spreadsheets, blueprints, and calm efficiency, and sometimes it survives because it knows how to apologize without confessing everything.